monument of silence. Imagine a place where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams. In the desolate frozen plains of the Murmansk region, far beyond the reach of civilization, there stands a monument to human curiosity. To the casual observer, it looks like junk. A pile of twisted concrete and a rusted welded metal cap. It is small, barely larger than the reach of a man's arms, but beneath that cap lies a wound in the world, a hole that descends straight down into the crushing darkness for 12,262 meters, the Kola Superdeep Borehole. This was a project born of pure Soviet ambition, a race to touch the very mantle of our planet. For 24 years, the diamond drills turned, grinding through ancient granite layer by layer, century by century. But in the late 1980s, something shifted. The scientists stopped being explorers and became witnesses to something that broke their minds. They wanted to reach the center of the world, but instead they found the source of human fear: the industrial Goliath. The project began in 1970 in a landscape where the sun disappears for months at a time. A massive industrial complex rose from the tundra, dominated by the Uralmash 15,000 tower. It was a structure taller than a 20-story building, a cathedral of steel and oil designed to house a monster. Thousands of the Soviet Union's finest engineers and geologists lived here in total isolation. They felt like conquerors. They were piercing the skin of Mother Earth. Every meter was a battle. The drill bit, weighing many tons, would take hours to descend into the heat of the crust. Every time the bit was pulled back up, it was dull and scorched. Up until the 12-kilometer mark, everything was going according to the blueprints. The rock was solid. The progress was steady. But as they crossed into the 13th kilometer, the physics of the deep began to fail. The breath of the deep. The temperature, which was supposed to stay at a manageable 100 degrees Celsius, suddenly spiked. The gauges began to spin wildly, hitting nearly 200 degrees. The rock became unexpectedly porous, almost hollow. The equipment, the strongest steel the Soviet Union could manufacture, began to melt, flowing like wax in the heat. But it wasn't the heat that made the crew stop talking. It was the vibration. A low, rhythmic, subsonic pulse. It didn't sound like shifting tectonic plates. It didn't sound like the grinding of stone. It sounded like a heavy, labored breathing, as if the earth itself was no longer a dead rock, but a living, sleeping giant. And with every turn of the drill, they were waking it up. The men on the surface looked at each other in the dim light of the control room, and for the first time they felt like they were being watched from below. The drill had reached a depth of over 12,000 meters when the resistance suddenly vanished. The massive motors, which had been straining against solid granite for years, began to spin freely. For a moment, the engineers thought the drill bit had snapped. But as they checked the tension, they realized something impossible had happened. They hadn't broken the equipment. They had broken through the Earth's crust into a massive hollow cavern. The air that hissed out of the borehole smelled of ancient sulfur and scorched minerals. The temperature sensors at the tip of the drill were screaming, recording a heat that should have been impossible at that depth. But it wasn't the heat that troubled Dr. Azakov, the project lead. It was the lack of geological logic. There shouldn't have been a void there, not at the roots of the world. The recording, driven by a mix of scientific curiosity and growing dread, Azakov made a decision that would later be labeled a psychological hazard by the KGB. He ordered a specialized, high-temperature microphone to be lowered into the shaft. This wasn't a standard piece of equipment. It was a marvel of Soviet engineering, designed to capture the groans of shifting tectonic plates and the subterranean flow of magma. The crew stood in absolute silence as the microphone descended into the black throat of the earth. Thousands of meters of cable unspooled, disappearing into the heat. In the control room, the speakers were initially filled with nothing but the low rhythmic hum of the machinery. Then, the static began to change. It started as a low whistle, like wind rushing through a canyon. But there was no wind 12 kilometers down, the Sea of Agony. Then, the sound arrived. It didn't come in waves, it hit the speakers like a physical blow. It wasn't the sound of shifting rock or pressurized gas, it was the sound of voices. At first, it was a discordant murmur, a chaotic overlay of white noise. But as the technicians adjusted the frequencies, the sound became terrifyingly clear. It was a cacophony of thousands, perhaps millions, of human-like screams. They were voices crying out in absolute, eternal agony. It sounded like a stadium filled with people being burned alive, their cries overlapping in a never-ending loop of torment. The recording wasn't just loud. It felt heavy, as if the sound itself was saturated with despair. In the small, dimly lit control room, the atmosphere shattered. One technician reportedly fell to his knees, covering his ears and weeping. Another stared at the oscilloscope, watching the jagged green waves that looked less like sound frequencies and more like a distorted wall of faces. Dr. Azakov himself sat frozen, his hand hovering over the stop button. The legend says that the voices weren't just screaming randomly. Those who listened closely claimed the screams began to harmonize. They began to chant in a language that felt older than the mountains. And then, the most chilling detail emerged. Some of the engineers claimed that amidst the sea of agony, they heard their own names being called out from the speakers. The exit that night, half of the drilling crew quit. They didn't ask for their pay. They didn't wait for the transport trucks. They simply walked away into the Arctic fog, leaving behind their equipment and their sanity. The recording was immediately seized by a special detachment of the KGB. It was placed in a lead-lined container and stamped with a classification that meant it was never to be heard by human ears again. The Soviet government officially denied the recording's existence, claiming it was nothing more than a glitch in the sensors. But the men who were there knew better. They knew they hadn't just reached the mantle of the earth. They had pierced the ceiling of the place the scriptures warned us about. They had lowered a microphone into the mouth of hell, and the things inside were now aware that the door was open. The 1989 incident. By the late 1980s, the atmosphere at the Kola Superdeep station had shifted from one of scientific triumph to one of quiet, suffocating dread. The recordings had been confiscated, but the sounds remained in the ears of everyone who had heard them. Then, in 1989, the mountain itself seemed to reject the intruders. Without warning, a massive, unexplained explosion rocked the drilling tower. It wasn't a gas explosion. There were no methane pockets detected, and no mechanical failure was found in the drills. It was a kinetic blast that seemed to originate from the very bottom of the shaft, 12 kilometers down. The force was so immense that it nearly sheared the drilling tower from its foundation. But what the survivors saw in the immediate aftermath was far more disturbing than the destruction of the equipment. The luminous guest eyewitnesses, many of whom were veteran engineers with no belief in the supernatural, reported a luminous, gaseous entity erupting from the mouth of the borehole along with the smoke. It was described as a dark shape, that seemed to swallow the light around it, pulsing with a faint, sickly violet glow. It didn't behave like gas or smoke. It hung in the air for a moment, suspended above the frantic crew, taking a vaguely human form before it vanished into the freezing Arctic fog. The silence that followed was absolute. For miles around the facility, every bird had fled and every dog in the Murmansk region reportedly began to howl at once, a mournful sound that echoed across the tundra. The men on site realized that the explosion wasn't an accident. It was a breach. Something had used the energy of the drill to climb up the throat of the earth. The drilling was halted immediately, but the facility could not be evacuated overnight. Those who stayed for the final decommissioning reported that they were no longer alone in the corridors. They began to see shadow men, figures that looked like silhouettes of people but lacked any features. These entities moved with a disturbing fluid grace, walking through the reinforced concrete walls as if they were made of mist. The shadow men didn't attack. They simply watched. They were found standing at the foot of engineers' beds in the middle of the night. They were seen in the reflections of the darkened laboratory windows. Most chillingly, they left no footprints in the snow, and they made no sound. It became a common belief among the remaining staff that these weren't ghosts of the dead, but copies. The things from the abyss were taking the shapes of the people they had heard through the microphone, learning how to exist in our world. The psychic toll. The mental health of the crew plummeted. Men who had spent decades in the harsh Arctic began to suffer from vivid shared hallucinations. They dreamt of a city made of black glass, deep beneath the granite, where the air was fire and the inhabitants had been waiting for the surface to cool. The facility's medical officer recorded cases of psychic resonance where technicians could hear each other's thoughts, but the thoughts were always screams. The Soviet government, realizing they were losing control over the site, sent in a special detachment of the KGB to oversee the final sealing. They didn't come to help the scientists. They came to ensure that whatever had climbed out of that hole didn't leave the mountain. The project was officially marked for termination. The door was half open, and the only solution left was to bury it under as much concrete as possible. The decommissioning, the end of the Kola Superdeep Borehole, was not a celebrated scientific conclusion. It was a retreat. By 1994, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and with it, the funding for Site 88 evaporated. But for those who had worked there, the lack of money was a convenient excuse. The truth was that the facility had become a place of sickness. The machinery was failing, the staff were plagued by nightmares, and the mountain itself seemed to be groaning under the weight of the secret it held. The massive Uralmash Tower, once a symbol of human triumph, was slowly dismantled and sold for scrap. The concrete buildings were left to the mercy of the Arctic winters. Today, if you travel to the Murmansk region, you will find a landscape of industrial rot, rusted beams, shattered glass, and the skeletal remains of a dream that turned into a nightmare. But in the center of the ruins, one thing remains untouched: the 12,000-meter seal. On the floor of the ruined laboratory, surrounded by gray slush and twisted rebar, lies the cap. It is a heavy, circular piece of steel, rusted to a deep orange brown, held down by a ring of 12 industrial-strength bolts. Scratched into the metal is a simple number: 12,232. It looks almost underwhelming. It is hard to believe that this small, weathered disk is the only thing standing between our world and the darkness that the scientists claim to have found. The hole is officially sealed for safety, but the locals tell a different story. They say the government didn't seal the hole to keep people from falling in. They sealed it to keep the voices from falling out. The cap isn't a lid. It's a plug in a wound that refuses to heal. Despite the facility being dead for decades, the site remains geologically active in ways that scientists struggle to explain. In the dead of winter, when the temperatures in the Murmansk tundra drop to 40 degrees below zero, the snow around the borehole cap does not settle. It melts. Explorers who have dared to visit the ruins report that the ground within a 10-meter radius of the seal is warm to the touch. There are no active power sources at the site. There is no volcanic activity in the region. Yet, a constant low-level thermal energy radiates from the hole, as if the heat the drills encountered in 1989 has never dissipated. Some say it is a natural geothermal phenomenon. Others believe it is the collective body heat of the thousands of entities that were heard on the tapes, huddled together just beneath the surface, waiting for the metal to rust through. The scratching. The most chilling reports come from those who have spent a night near the ruins. They claim that if the wind dies down and the tundra falls silent, you can hear more than just the hum of the earth. If you press your ear against the rusted metal of the cap, you can hear a faint rhythmic scratching. It is the sound of something metallic, or perhaps something with claws dragging across the underside of the steel. It is a slow, patient sound. It suggests that whatever climbed up the shaft in 1989 didn't leave when the lights went out. It stayed. It is waiting for the bolts to fail. It is waiting for the curiosity of a new generation to outweigh their fear. The final warning. We spent decades trying to see what was at the bottom of the world. We spent billions of rubles to pierce the skin of the planet, believing that knowledge was always a virtue. But the Kola Superdeep taught us a different lesson. Some doors are locked for a reason. Some secrets are buried under 12 kilometers of solid granite because they were never meant to breathe our air. The next time you look at a map of the world, remember that beneath the blue oceans and the green forests, there is a dark, hollow reality that we barely understand. The steel cap is still there, rusting in the Arctic snow. The scratching continues, and the abyss is still listening. Sleep well, if you can.